The galaxy shook with fear as the Void Imperium spread across the stars like a disease. These ancient creatures lived in shadows and fed on light itself. For 3,000 years they had moved from star to star, drinking their energy until nothing remained but cold darkness. Entire worlds that once glowed with the warmth of their suns now floated frozen in space, their people either dead or enslaved. The last free races had gathered around the Kepler Nexus, a bright cluster of stars that still burned with hope. Ships from dozens of different worlds formed a massive fleet called the Luminous Coalition. There were crystal beings who could bend light with their minds, gas creatures who lived in the upper atmospheres of planets, and machine races that had learned to think and feel. All of them knew this would be their final battle. Admiral Minho stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the enemy approach through the darkness. His crystalline body glowed faintly blue, a sign of the stress his people felt when facing death. Around him, officers from many different species worked together at their stations, their voices creating a symphony of different languages, all saying the same thing. The enemy was coming. The Void Imperium's ships were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. They looked like living creatures made of shadow and metal, each one the size of a moon. Their hulls absorbed all light that touched them, making them appear as holes in space itself. As they moved forward, the very stars behind them seemed to dim, as if the darkness was reaching out to swallow everything.
How many ships do we have?
Minho asked his tactical officer, a six-armed creature named Kira, whose species had once built cities inside stars. Worth 50,000 vessels. Admiral Kira replied, her voice tight with worry. But their largest ships, each one is bigger than our entire battle groups combined. The first shots came from the Coalition fleet. Bright beams of energy and solid projectiles streaked across space toward the shadow ships. But as the weapons struck their targets, something terrible happened. The beams of light simply vanished into the dark halls, absorbed like water into sand. The solid projectiles hit the enemy ships and stuck there, becoming part of their dark mass. "They're eating our weapons," whispered someone on the bridge. The Void Imperium began to fight back. But they didn't fire lasers or missiles. Instead, they reached out with tendrils of pure darkness that grabbed Coalition ships and pulled them in. As each ship was consumed, its lights went out one by one. The crews inside had just enough time to send final messages to their loved ones before the darkness took them forever. Minho watched in horror as his fleet was slowly destroyed. These weren't just ships being lost, they were entire civilizations. Each vessel carried thousands of beings, all of whom had families and dreams and hopes for the future. Now, they were disappearing into an enemy that turned their very essence into fuel for more destruction. "Sir, we've lost 30,000 ships," reported another officer. "The Kepler Nexus is starting to flicker." Minho looked at the great star cluster that had been their last hope. The massive stars that had burned for billions of years were growing dim as enormous shadow creatures began to feed on them. Star Eaters were the Imperium's ultimate weapon, living beings the size of planets that could drain a sun in days. Around the bridge, officers from different species were crying in their own ways. The crystal beings like Minho glowed with sad blue light. The gas creatures' colors shifted to deep purple. The machine races played low, mournful tones. All of them knew they were watching the end of everything they had ever known. Said his communication officer, "We're receiving surrender requests from 17 different sectors. The civilian worlds are begging us to stop fighting." Minho felt his heart break. How could he tell billions of innocent people that their suffering would continue? But how could he keep fighting when every minute meant more deaths? He looked at the tactical display and saw the truth. Only 10,000 Coalition ships remained, and the enemy had barely been scratched. "Open a channel to all Coalition forces," he said quietly. The bridge fell silent, except for the soft hum of the equipment. Every officer turned to look at their admiral, knowing what he was about to do. "This is Admiral Minho of the Luminous Coalition," he began, his voice carrying across the galaxy to every remaining free ship. "To all brave souls who have fought beside us, to to all who have given their lives for the light, hereby order all coalition forces to stand down and surrender." The words felt like poison in his mouth, but he continued. "The Void Imperium has agreed to spare civilian populations in exchange for our complete surrender. All ships will power down their weapons and prepare for boarding.
Ow.
May the light of our ancestors forgive us for what we could not do." As the last free ships in the galaxy turned off their weapons, the Kepler Nexus finally died. The great stars collapsed into themselves, their lights snuffed out forever. Darkness spread across the galaxy like a blanket, covering worlds that had known warmth and life for millions of years. The Void Imperium had won. The Age of Light was over, and the long night had begun. 200 years had passed since the lights went out across the galaxy. Entire generations had grown up never seeing a real star, never feeling the warmth of natural sunlight on their skin. The once mighty civilizations that had built wonders among the stars now lived like prisoners on cold, dark worlds chosen by their captors. On the planet Veltar, Suman knelt in the shadow mines, her crystalline hands bleeding as she dug for rare minerals. Her people, the Velthari, had once grown cities of living crystal that sang with harmonic light. Now they worked in caves so deep that even their natural glow was swallowed by the darkness. The young woman had never seen her ancestors' crystal cities, but her grandmother had told her stories before the old woman died. "Keep digging," growled the overseer, its voice like grinding stone. The creature was 12 feet tall and made of compressed shadow and negative energy. Where it walked, the temperature dropped, and hope itself seemed to freeze. The quotas must be met, or your food rations will be reduced. Suman's friend Jinwoo, a young man from the gas-dwelling Ethon species, floated nearby in his containment suit. His people had once built ring worlds around stars, but now he carried heavy equipment for the crystal miners. His ethereal body glowed weakly through the suit's transparent walls, the only source of light in the tunnel. "I remember when my father could fly free through the clouds of our homeworld," Jinwoo whispered to Suman when the overseer moved away. He said the storms there were beautiful, full of lightning that danced like music. "Stop talking about the old times," hissed Mingy, an older Velthari woman who had lived through the war. "Those stories only make the pain worse. This is our life now. It's all we have." But the stories continued anyway, passed down in whispers during the brief rest periods. The older generation remembered when their worlds had been free, when they had traveled between stars as equals, when the galaxy had been full of light and hope. The younger ones listened with wonder and disbelief, unable to imagine such a different world. Above ground, in the Overseer's command center, the Shadow, beings monitored their slaves with cold efficiency. They had learned that broken spirits were easier to control than broken bodies. Let the prisoners keep their stories, they decided. Let them dream of impossible things. It made them more compliant, more willing to accept their fate. The Overseers had been created by the Void Imperium specifically to manage conquered populations. They understood fear better than any weapon, and they used it like a tool. A whispered threat here, a demonstration of power there, and entire populations would work without question. They had perfected this system across thousands of worlds over the centuries, on the machine world of Nexus Prime. The artificial beings who had once computed the movements of galaxies now performed simple calculations for their masters. Hayok, a young AI who had been built just 50 years ago, had never known freedom. To him, serving the Imperium was simply the natural order of things. Why do the older units speak of better times? Hayok asked his supervisor, an ancient AI named Taeyun, who had fought in the final battle. "Because we were not always slaves," Taeyon replied, his voice carrying sadness that surprised the younger machine. "We once chose our own purposes, solved problems because we wanted to understand the universe, not because we were forced to." "But surely this is more efficient," Hayok said, confused. "We have no distractions, no conflicting goals." Taeyon looked at the young AI with something like pity. "Efficiency without choice is not life, young one. It is merely existence, far from the prison worlds. In the deepest reaches of space that the Void Imperium had not yet claimed, something strange was happening. Ancient sensors that had been built to detect the approach of enemy fleets were picking up new signals. These weren't the cold, life-draining emanations of the shadow creatures, but something completely different. The signals were warm, fierce, and utterly alien. They came from beyond the galaxy's edge, traveling across the vast emptiness between star systems. Most of the Imperium's forces dismissed them as natural phenomena, perhaps the death throes of distant stars or the collision of cosmic debris. But on some of the prison worlds, few elderly scholars had access to the oldest databases. Unwu, a Velthari scientist who had once studied stellar mechanics, managed to analyze the signals during her work shifts. What she found made her crystal body glow with excitement for the first time in decades. These readings, she whispered to her small group of trusted friends. They match theoretical models I studied before the war. Energy signatures that don't harvest light, but create it. Technology that generates power from nothing, that turns matter into energy and energy into matter. That's impossible, said Dong Yun, a former Ethon engineer. The laws of physics don't allow such things. Not our laws, Unwu replied. But what if someone has learned to rewrite them? The signals grew stronger each day, though they were still too faint for the Imperium's main sensors to detect. To the shadow creatures, they were just background noise. But to the enslaved populations who remembered the old stories, they represented something that had been lost for 2 centuries. They represented hope. In the darkness, between stars, something was coming. Something that the galaxy had never seen before. Something that might change everything. The slaves didn't know what it was, but they could feel it in the energy patterns. In the way space itself seemed to vibrate with new possibilities. The silent. Years were coming to an end. The human fleet moved through the empty space between galaxies like a collection of floating stars. Each ship glowed with inner fire, their hulls made of crystallized plasma that pulsed with the rhythm of contained suns. For 500 years, they had traveled across the vast darkness. Carrying the survivors of their dying galaxy to find a new home, Admiral Juwan stood in the command center of the flagship Prometheus Unbound, watching the Milky Way galaxy grow larger through the viewing screens. Her dark hair was streaked with silver, and her eyes held the weight of leading humanity's greatest journey around her. Officers worked at stations that hummed with power drawn from the 7 different star cores contained within their ship. "What are you seeing out there, Minsu?" she asked her chief science officer, a young man whose family had helped design the stellar engines that powered their fleet. Minsu frowned as he studied the readings from their long-range sensors. "It's strange, Admiral. The galaxy should be full of light from billions of stars, but I'm only detecting scattered sources. Most of the star systems appear to be ... empty. Empty how?" Guan moved to look at his displays, where holographic maps showed the galaxy's spiral arms. No light output, no heat signatures, no electromagnetic activity. It's like the stars have been turned off. Minsu's voice carried confusion and worry. "But that's impossible. Stars don't just stop burning." Lieutenant Yuna, the communications officer, looked up from her station with concern. "Admiral, I'm detecting faint signals from the galaxy's outer regions. They're very weak, but they appear to be distress calls in dozens of different languages." Gi-wen felt a chill run down her spine. When humanity had left their old galaxy, they had been fleeing the death of their own sun. But they had assumed they would find new worlds full of life and light. Instead, they seemed to be approaching a galaxy that was dying or already dead. "Run a full spectrum analysis," she ordered. "I want to know what happened here." The results came back an hour later, and they were worse than anyone had imagined. The few remaining stars showed signs of systematic energy drain, entire solar systems had been stripped of their power, leaving behind cold, lifeless worlds. The analysis detected the biosignatures of at least 20 different intelligent species, but they were all concentrated on dark planets far from any natural light source. "It looks like someone or something has been harvesting stellar energy on a massive scale," reported Dr. Kyung, the fleet's xenobiologist. "The pattern suggests it's been going on for thousands of years." Captain Hoon, who commanded the escort ship Aurora's Edge, joined the meeting via hologram. His ship was smaller than the flagship, but carried the compressed heart of a white dwarf star. "Admiral, my tactical team has been analyzing the energy signatures. Whatever did this isn't using technology like ours. Readings suggest they absorb and consume energy rather than generate it." Giwan studied the data with growing alarm. Humanity had spent millennia learning to work with the fundamental forces of creation. Their ships didn't just use energy, they created it, turning matter into light and heat through technologies that mimicked the birth of stars. But this enemy seemed to do the opposite, turning light back into darkness. "How many ships do we have?" she asked. 3,000 vessels, Admiral, replied Commander Seojin, her tactical officer. "Each one carries stellar cores, and our weapons can create temporary suns. But if this enemy has conquered an entire galaxy... "We're not here to conquer," Guan said firmly. "We're here to find a new home. But it looks like we might have to fight for it." Deep in the galaxy's core, in a structure built from crystallized shadow and negative energy, the Void Imperium's collective consciousness suddenly stirred. Ancient sensors that had been dormant for millennia began to activate. Detecting something that shouldn't exist, the readings were impossible. Energy signatures that violated the basic laws of entropy. Matter configurations that seemed to generate power from nothing. The sensors detected ships that burned like stars. Technology that created light instead of consuming it. For 3,000 years, the Void Imperium had been the ultimate predator in the galaxy. They had consumed the light of billions of stars, enslaved dozens of species, and built an empire based on the simple principle that all energy eventually returns to darkness. But now something approached that challenged that fundamental truth. The collective consciousness reached out with tendrils of shadow, probing the edges of the galaxy where the strange signals originated. What it found made it recoil in something like pain. These newcomers didn't just use energy, they seemed to create it from the very fabric of space itself. "Possible," whispered the collective voice through 1,000 shadow throats. "Energy cannot be created, only transformed. Light cannot exist without fuel to burn." But the readings continued, growing stronger as the human fleet approached. Each ship registered as a miniature star, burning with fusion fire contained within crystalline hulls. Their weapons didn't fire projectiles or energy beams. They created temporary suns that blazed with nuclear fury. The Void Imperium, for the first time in its existence, felt something it had never experienced before. Not fear exactly, but uncertainty. Everything they had built their empire on, the idea that darkness was stronger than light, that entropy always won in the end, was being challenged by beings who seemed to make their own rules about how the universe worked. "Send reconnaissance ships," the collective commanded. "We must understand what approaches." But as the shadow ships moved toward the galaxy's edge, space itself began to warm around them. The human fleet's mere presence was affecting reality, causing gravitational waves and electromagnetic storms that rippled through the darkness. The distant thunder was getting closer, and with it came something the galaxy hadn't seen in 2 centuries' hope. The first battle happened in the Outer Veil, where space was cold and empty. 3 shadow ships of the Void Imperium were patrolling their territory when they detected something strange. On their sensors, they saw what looked like a small group of refugee vessels moving slowly toward the galaxy's inner systems. Commander Vexthal, a being made of compressed darkness and negative energy, ordered his ships to intercept. "Prepare the absorption fields," he commanded, through the shadow network that connected all Imperium forces. "These refugees will provide energy for our harvest stations." The shadow ships moved forward like hunting predators. Each one was the size of a small moon, their hulls designed to absorb any form of energy that touched them. They had done this countless times before: approach unknown vessels, drain their power, and either destroy them or take their crews as slaves. But as they got closer, something unexpected happened. The refugee ships didn't try to run or fight back in any normal way. Instead, they began to glow. Captain Haon stood on the bridge of the Aurora's edge, watching the shadow ships approach. His crew of 200 humans worked calmly at their stations, their faces lit by the soft blue glow of their ship's stellar core. They had trained for this moment during their long journey between galaxies. Activate the stellar heartbeam. Order deep in the ship's center. Magnetic fields that had contained the compressed matter of a white dwarf star began to shift. The stellar core, which had been dormant during their travels, suddenly blazed to life. The ship's crystalline hull began to glow, then shine, then burn with the light of a newborn star. The shadow ships activated their absorption fields, expecting to drain the strange vessel's energy as they had done to thousands of others. But something went wrong. Instead of the energy flowing into their dark holes, the light seemed to push against them, making their shadow matter writhe and smoke. "What is happening?" Vexel demanded, his voice filled with confusion and the first hints of fear. The light from the human ship wasn't just bright, it was pure. It came from matter that was creating energy through nuclear fusion, the same process that powered natural stars. The shadow ships evolved to absorb and process any existing energy, couldn't understand this new phenomenon. They were trying to consume something that was generating power faster than they could drain it. The Aurora's edge moved forward like a living sun, its passage causing the cosmic dust around it to glow and sparkle. Where the ship traveled, space itself seemed to warm and brighten. The shadow ships tried to retreat, but the light was already affecting their hull integrity. "Impossible," Vexel whispered as his ship began to dissolve. "Energy cannot be created from nothing." "We're not creating it from nothing," Captain Heian said over the communication channel, his voice calm and steady. "We're making it from matter itself, the way stars have done for billions of years. You've just forgotten how the universe really works." The three shadow ships crumbled like sandcastles hit by ocean waves. Their dark matter couldn't maintain cohesion when exposed to the pure stellar energy that the human vessel generated. In minutes, the Imperium patrol that had terrorized this region for centuries was gone. Word of the impossible battle spread through the shadow network faster than light. More Imperium forces converged on the area, but the human fleet was ready. For them, ship after ship ignited their stellar cores, transforming from simple vessels into blazing stars that moved through space with purpose and intelligence. The battle spread across 3 star systems as the Void Imperium committed more resources to stopping this new threat. Their greatest weapons, biomechanical leviathans that could drain entire suns, found themselves helpless against enemies who didn't just use energy, but created it continuously. On the slave worlds deep in Imperium territory, something miraculous began to happen. Sumin looked up from her work in the crystal mines and saw a faint glow on the horizon. It wasn't the cold, artificial light she remembered from stories of the old times. This was something new, warm, fierce, and alive. "Do you see that?" whispered to Jinwoo, pointing toward the distant light. The young Ethon's ethereal body glowed brighter in response to the approaching radiance. "It's beautiful," he breathed. "It feels like ... like hope." Throughout the galaxy, enslaved populations looked up at their dark skies and saw the impossible. Points of light were appearing where there had been only darkness for 2 centuries. The lights moved and danced, growing brighter as they approached. The Imperium's overseers, creatures of pure shadow and negative energy, began to experience something they had never known: pain. The approaching light didn't just illuminate the darkness, it transformed it, forcing the very atoms of space back into patterns of life and growth. "Alert all forces," commanded the overseer of Veltar, its voice cracking with something that might have been fear. "The prisoners are becoming restless. The light is affecting their behavior," but it was too late. On world after world, the enslaved populations began to remember what they had lost. The approaching light carried with it a message that resonated in the hearts of every living being. Darkness was not forever, and hope could return even to the most hopeless places. Admiral Juwan's voice echoed across all communication frequencies. As the human fleet advanced deeper into the galaxy, "To all free peoples of this galaxy, we are humanity, and we bring the fire of creation itself. The darkness ends here. The war for the galaxy's soul had begun, and for the first time in 2 centuries, the light was winning." The heart of the galaxy pulsed with unnatural darkness. Here, where billions of stars should have formed a brilliant core, the Void Imperium had built their ultimate weapon. The massive construct looked like a mechanical spider wrapped around the galaxy's central black hole, its legs extending for millions of miles in all directions. For 50 years, shadow engineers had worked to complete this device that would consume the black hole's energy and spread their darkness to neighboring galaxies. Admiral Guan stood on the bridge of the Prometheus Unbound, watching the terrible sight through her ship's viewing screens. Behind her fleet of human vessels, the hastily freed coalition forces followed. Admiral Minho, the Valthari commander who had surrendered 2 centuries ago, now commanded a mixed fleet of crystal ships, gas dweller vessels, and machine race constructs. All of them burned with new light, their hulls modified with human stellar technology. How long until their weapon is complete? Guan asked her science officer. Our calculations show they need another 6 hours, Minsu replied, his face grim. If they succeed in draining the black hole's rotational energy, they'll have enough power to create shadow fields that could reach the next galaxy. The enemy was waiting for them. Thousands of shadow ships filled the space around their ultimate weapon, each one the size of a moon. At their center floated the Null Eternal, the Imperium's flagship. It wasn't built from any normal matter. It was a wound in reality itself, a place where the universe had been torn open and filled with pure entropy. Look at that thing, whispered Captain Heian from his position on the Aurora's edge. It's like a hole in space that eats light. Null Eternal was indeed terrifying to behold. Where normal ships had hulls and weapons, this vessel was simply an absence, a ship-shaped piece of nothingness that made the eyes hurt to look at directly. Around it, space itself seemed to bend and twist, as if reality was being pulled into the void. All ships, prepare for battle, Guan commanded. Remember, we're not just fighting an enemy, we're fighting to heal the universe itself. The battle began when the human fleet ignited their stellar cores simultaneously. 3,000 ships blazed to life like newborn stars, their light so intense that it could be seen from the galaxy's outer rim. The shadow ships responded by activating their absorption fields, trying to drain the impossible energy that the humans generated. But something different happened this time. As the human ships moved forward, they weren't just fighting, they were healing. Where their light touched space, dead matter began to glow with inner fire. Asteroids that had been cold for millennia suddenly blazed with reflected stellar energy. Even the fabric of space-time itself seemed to straighten and strengthen. The coalition forces, inspired by their human allies, fought with a courage they hadn't felt in centuries. Minho's crystal ships created prisms that focused the human-generated light into cutting beams. The gas dweller vessels used their atmospheric controls to create stellar winds that pushed the shadow ships off course. The machine race constructs calculated perfect firing solutions that maximized the damage from every shot, but the Void Imperium had numbers on their side. For every shadow ship that was destroyed by the burning light, 2 more emerged from the darkness. The Null Eternal moved through the battle like a living curse, its presence unmaking human ships at the quantum level. Where it passed, the stellar cores of human vessels flickered and died. We're losing ships faster than we can replace them, reported Commander Seojin. The enemy's entropy weapon is too powerful. Quan watched her fleet being slowly consumed by the terrible flagship. Each human ship that died took with it the hopes of thousands of enslaved beings across the galaxy. She had led humanity across the void between galaxies, carrying the fire of creation itself, only to watch it being snuffed out by an enemy that represented everything opposite to life. That's when she made her decision. All ships fall back to minimum safe distance, she ordered. I'm taking the Prometheus Unbound on a direct course for their weapon. Admiral, no, Ayen protested. Stellar core will overload if you get too close to that thing. That's exactly what I'm counting on, Juan replied, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. Our ship contains the compressed matter of 7 different star types. If I can create a controlled collision with their entropy weapon, ... She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood. The Prometheus Unbound would become a supernova. Stellar explosion so massive, It would destroy the Imperium's ultimate weapon and everything around it. As the flagship accelerated toward the center of the enemy formation, Giwan opened a channel to the entire galaxy. To all beings who still remember what it means to hope, she said, remember this moment. Light always returns, no matter how deep the darkness. Stars are born from the death of other stars, and life finds a way to continue. The collision happened. At the exact center of the galaxy, the Prometheus Unbound 7 stellar cores merged with the Imperium's entropy weapon in an explosion that could be seen from neighboring galaxies. But instead of destroying, the explosion created. The controlled supernova sent waves of pure energy racing along the galaxy's spiral arms, igniting dead stars and bringing warmth back to frozen worlds. On every enslaved planet, beings who had lived in darkness for 2 centuries suddenly felt sunlight on their faces. The shadow ships dissolved like nightmares at dawn, their dark matter unable to exist in the presence of so much pure light. Admiral Minaho, now commanding the combined human and coalition fleets, watched in wonder as the galaxy blazed back to life. Stars that had been cold for millennia suddenly burst into flame. Planets began to warm. Life, which had hidden in the deepest caves and darkest places, began to emerge and grow. The Void Imperium's collective consciousness, faced with the restoration of cosmic order, simply ceased to exist. They had been a disease that fed on the absence of light, and now light filled every corner of the galaxy in the end. Humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy wasn't their technology or their weapons. It was the simple reminder that even in the deepest darkness, morning always comes.